what happens also is that the companies then have to build a comprehensive privacy program that then for a period of 20 years, and they have to be audited annually. So consequences are pretty dire if you think about it. If you're not telling the truth about your data collection practices, make sure that when your programmers make changes into your code, that when they make those changes into the code, make sure that it's reflected in the privacy policy. So kind of like the developers, the programmers, they have to do their work hand in hand with the company management to make sure that, what we state in our privacy policy is actually true. There's a lot that comes into play when we pair beacons with mobile apps and the sensors that we have on our mobile devices.
Got it.
But there's a huge change underway in Europe right now. In 2018, there's a new General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR. And also the fines will increase significantly for violations. So we're looking at potentially fines of 4% of worldwide annual turnover for larger companies, multinationals.
Well, that's going to concentrate your mind. Welcome to episode 15 of the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Beacosystem. And this week we are going to be talking about privacy in some depth with the author of the privacy chapter from our book, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Beacosystem. So my name's Steve Statler of Statler Consulting. We do this in partnership with Proxbook. And a kind of Proxbook alumni is our guest, Jarno Vanto, who is partner of Borenius Attorneys based in New York, but with a very cosmopolitan accent. Jarno, welcome to the show.
Thanks, really much appreciated. Great to be here today.
Yeah, and I really appreciate you writing that chapter. I often joke to people that actually your chapter is worth the price of the book. You're a lawyer and you focus on privacy. Can you tell us, a little bit about your history with the subject?
Sure. I'm not going to go through my entire resume, but just to summarize on privacy, I've been working on privacy-related matters in both Europe and in the United States for about 12 years now. And I've been dealing with all kinds of companies' privacy issues, ranging from just industrial conglomerates who work across the world to mobile apps that put apps out on the App Store. So it just runs the gamut. Really been a kind of a broad experience and all kinds of interesting privacy issues.
Why did you decide to focus on the area?
Well, I've always loved technology and I've always bought the latest gadgets, the whole thing. But then it was when I was studying law, it was an emerging practice area, and given my interest in technology, I thought it was a good fit, and it's been growing as a practice area ever since.
Well, you're a very good writer as well as an accomplished lawyer, from everything I can tell as a layperson that spends a lot of time with lawyers. So you did a fantastic job in writing the chapter. And I kind of read it and I thought, wow, I feel really well informed now. What's Jarno going to do? He's like not going to get any clients. What is it that you end up doing as part of your privacy practice? Why do people retain your services?
Well, I mean, beacons and related technologies is just one area of this kind of broader range of issues. And for example, I build a lot of just what you'd call them comprehensive privacy programs for companies that are involved with data. And there's, just in recent years, there have been many companies whose only business is data. And so they need to have a compliance program because they're dealing with data globally. They need to understand local laws. So we tried to build a program for privacy compliance that fits the needs of that particular company. And then Then there's, day-to-day things like drafting privacy policies for mobile apps and websites. That's what I do a lot. And you always have to have your own privacy policy for the kind of app and kind of data collection that you do. And so no copy-paste jobs. And then, of course, when companies have to deal with regulators, if they have compliance issues or questions, then I also interact on behalf of clients with the regulators. And then one of the major challenges, I would say, for companies that are operating globally is that different countries in the world have these restrictions on how you can move data out of those countries to other countries. And I help companies comply with those restrictions and make sure that when they transfer data from, for example, from the EU to the US, they do so in a compliant way.
Excellent. And that actually is a great lead into the rest of our discussion. And what I would like to do today, talking with you, is really dig into why entrepreneurs should give some thought to privacy, especially in this beacon proximity ecosystem. And then we'll talk a bit about the US, the EU, and if we have time, Asia Pacific, just kind of get a sense of what the differences are. And then I think, the meat of it, or probably the final piece is what are the best practices? What is it that people should be doing? So let's start off with, why should a Beacosystem entrepreneur care about privacy?
Well, as we both know, beacons themselves are sort of dumb devices. They don't really collect any data. But when you have a mobile app that interacts with the beacon, the amount of data is quite extensive that can be generated. So when we understand that we need to tell the users of mobile devices about the types of data that are being collected, where the data goes, what are the purposes of its use and all that, and so we really are then we understand that the privacy actually cuts quite close to the beacon world and Beacosystem.
Let's spread a little bit of fear to concentrate people's minds. If people don't do this, what can happen?
Well, all right. So, first of all, if we have to talk about different countries and different jurisdictions, like the lawyers say, in a different way. And for example, in the United States, one of the key enforcers of the law on consumer protection is the Federal Trade Commission, based in Washington, D.C., and they monitor what lawyers call consumer disclosures. So, for example, privacy policies that companies put up on their websites or mobile applications, right? And there have been several cases over the last couple of years where, for example, companies that are in the Beacosystem or near the Beacosystem, so to speak. So, for example, in-store tracking companies or Wi-Fi tracking companies that have told something in their privacy policies, but which wasn't in fact true, and then the FTC investigated them, and they ended up entering the settlement orders and had to pay serious fines. We're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars in some cases. And what happens also is that the companies then have to build a comprehensive privacy program that then for a period of 20 years, and they have to be audited annually. So consequences are pretty dire if you think about it, if you're not telling the truth about your data collection practices.
So it can be expensive if you get caught doing something different to what you tell people you're going to do. And if you kind of took the shortcut because you hate red tape, you could actually end up having a lot more red tape than you ever dreamt of.
Exactly. And what I always tell my clients, for example, in the mobile app space, is that make sure that when your programmers make changes into your code, that when they make those changes into the code, make sure that it's reflected in the privacy policy. So kind of like the developers, the programmers, they have to do the work hand in hand with the company management to make sure that what we state in our privacy policy is actually true about what types of data we collect.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like it's a real team effort because you got to have like the product manager, the programmer, the lawyer, the marketing guy. I mean, everyone is going to have to pitch in, and the finance guy needs to sign off on actually spending time and money on this. And
exactly.
So it's not, let's go to Borenius and get a privacy policy, job done. It's actually more than that. And I think the other thing that just really struck me, because I know that, I've started startups, and I know that you have to, focusing on just survival.
Yes.
But, what we've already seen in the Beacon ecosystem is, aside from all those other bad things, the expense, the hassle, all that stuff, you can have your beacons taken down. So you can have local government mayors saying, no, not in my city. And that's not good. Okay.
Well, happened here in New York City in connection with these phone booth beacons that they were installing. They had to be taken out as well because it is just public concerns about the privacy aspects. So it's really happening.
So, okay, hopefully that's kind of got people's attention. I mean, I guess the other thing that is sort of interesting about this privacy stuff is that we're in an age when people are publishing naked pictures of themselves on Facebook. So, that would be the kind of the counter argument, I guess, is why the heck are we worrying about all this stuff when these, it's the kids are going to be taking over and they're all naked on Facebook anyway. So
yeah. But if we think of data collection and privacy is essentially, don't want to go into the legal philosophical aspects of it too much, but what studies have found that teenagers are actually very concerned about the data being collected from or about their devices and themselves. So they actually do read some of the privacy policies that maybe more senior citizens would not read at all, and they're concerned about the privacy practices of these apps that they use. So, for example, like that your pictures will stay out there only for a certain amount of time. That they don't collect too much information for ad purposes, things like that. So I think that while yes, I mean, as such, like people can disclose more about themselves on social media and things like that. But then, for example, the data collection that's going on sort of underneath the surface is a concern for these younger people.
Well, and I think the thing that has struck me as someone who's worked for a beacon company is you can accept that 99% of people do not read the privacy statement. I think in your chapter you say you could probably copy and paste the text from Mein Kampf and people wouldn't know. Yep. But the problem is 1% of the people do, and we've got this thing called social media, and so then it goes from this very esoteric thing to something that gets boiled down and everyone jumps on the bandwagon, and it's pretty ugly at that point. One last thing before we get into what's happening around the world in terms of the rules. What a lot of beacon entrepreneurs say is, hey, well, beacons actually, they don't track you. They're just broadcasting data. Therefore, privacy isn't an issue for us. Can you kind of give that a quick run through and tell us whether that is just rubbish or...
Yeah, well, I mean, as I mentioned in the beginning, beacons themselves don't really engage in much data collection, but when you have a mobile app that interacts with a beacon, there's a whole lot of data collection taking place. For example, if we add meaning or context to those beacons through software, we can actually extract a lot of data. For example, what the person is, for example, in the physical world, all kinds of things that they looked online, kinds of advertising, maybe potentially even like once there's enough segmentation around the beacons, for example, you can tell where in the store they are. So there's a lot of stuff that beacons help in accessing. So there are the privacy issues, and for example, then we come to, for example, if there's location data, we know where the mobile device is in the physical world. Then the general rule is that we have to obtain opt-in consent for the collection of location data. That applies pretty much both in the European Union and in the United States. And if there's sharing of that data with third parties, for example, for advertising purpose, generally we have to tell these users of these mobile devices this data collection is taking place, and it can potentially be shared with others and all that. So there's a lot that comes into play when we pair beacons with mobile apps and the sensors that we have on our mobile devices.
Got it. So to the degree that you're creating software that uses the beacons, then that's when the issues arise. And I think it is fair to point out to people that beacons aren't tracking. So it's not like it's not like Wi-Fi tracking where you are listening in, but that doesn't absolve you, because almost certainly you have some software there, and that's where you need to be very careful. Well, let's kind of look at the difference between the US, Europe, and Asia Pacific. And having grown up in the UK, I tend to default to, we do things better in Europe, and look, we've got this great privacy legislation. But so first of all, are there any privacy laws in the US, or is it just chaos?
Well, the U.S. laws are more sectoral in nature. It's kind of a cliche that we privacy lawyers tend to repeat, that the U.S. law is sectoral. There is no overarching regulation like there is in Europe, where currently there is what is called the Data Protection Directive. It's been enforced since 1995, basically, and all these national laws of the 28 member states implement that, and that governs all processing of personal data.
Okay, so just so we're talking about Europe, and just to kind of make sure I'm absorbing it. So there's a EU directive,
yes,
and the actual legislation is within each of the member countries.
Right.
And in the US, we don't have the equivalent of that kind of national, all-encompassing law. So we can do whatever we like.
No. First of all, and then just going back to the EU a little bit, there's a huge change underway in Europe right now. In 2018, there's a new General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR, that basically, because the directive means that it's implemented in national laws, and there's all kinds of differences between the member states, although the background is the same for every one of these laws. But in 2018, there should be uniform regulation throughout all the EU member states. And also the fines will increase significantly for violations. So we're looking at potentially fines of 4% of worldwide annual turnover for larger companies, multinationals.
Well, that's going to concentrate your mind.
Yeah, but so coming back to the U.S. So there's all this sectoral also. For example, what cuts close to home for Beacosystem companies, for example, is COPPA, which is Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, and it basically prohibits the collection of personally identifiable information related to children without affirmative parental consent that's been obtained in advance.
So this is the bane of Disney's life, isn't it? They're desperately trying to make money, and then basically it's really, really hard.
But for example, there was a case just this past year that the FTC entered into an agreement with a company that was collecting Wi-Fi data from children's mobile devices, and did not obtain parental consent for doing so, and so there are laws that are important, but and then also just because I talked about the FTC, so the FTC can monitor all these consumer disclosures about what Beacosystem companies are telling consumers about their privacy practices. And then also states' attorneys general have a jurisdiction to enforce consumer disclosures. So again, privacy policies. And it's not just at the federal level. And then we have a lot of self-regulation because the advertising industry has kept the legislators at bay, so to speak, by creating actually very well-developed self-regulatory schemes for mobile advertising and internet advertising. For example, the Network Advertising Initiative has a code of conduct, and Digital Advertising Alliance has rules for companies on mobile and internet advertising, and so. And then those rules apply to the codes apply to the membership of those organizations, and so and they're pretty strict in enforcing the rules included in those codes and model rules on their membership.
Okay, but going back to the FTC, so there's some legislation that impacts collecting data from children, and these days children have phones, so that's material. It's not something that can be ignored. But can the FTC, if the FTC are they offering advice, guidance, or can they actually? How can they fine you if there's no federal law about opt-in and all the other things that you should be doing?
Yeah, well, the FTC basically enforces a law that prohibits unfair or deceptive acts in or affecting commerce under the FTC Act Section 5. And unfair or deceptive acts, for example, are privacy policies that don't tell the truth to consumers about data collection practices. Mm-hmm. So that's how the FTC gets to you. Usually, if you're in this Beacos space and you're not telling the truth to consumers about your data collection practices.
Right. So you kind of got to have a privacy policy because otherwise you'll be called out. I mean, Better Business Bureau, they won't give you a rating unless you have a privacy policy. So yeah. You kind of have to have one, and then they get you if you say something and you don't actually do it, and they can actually fine you serious money. And before we kind of move on to Europe, what's your prognosis on the likelihood of actually having clear legislation? Because it seems like Al Franken, one of his big causes is trying to put something in place, but nothing ever seems to happen.
I would wait and see. There's, for example, it's interesting and this ties to Europe, and so Europe 2018 is going to have this kind of overarching uniform law, and right now, just in the beginning of August, we finally have this EU-US privacy shield for companies that are operating between the EU and the United States and transferring data across the Atlantic. So gradually, I think that these European initiatives are actually going to have an impact on U.S. legislation, either directly or indirectly, but they're definitely going to generate more effort to have similar laws in the United States as well, and of course, depending on what happens in the elections this November, some of those initiatives could advance faster than thought. But I do think that that these self-regulatory initiatives that the U.S. industry has developed have tamped down a little bit these initiatives on having a sort of a federal law on privacy.
Okay, so let's just go. You've talked about Europe already, 2018, and the fines potentially going up. But what's the quick summary of what the European directives are actually mandating? Can you go through?
Well, for example, one of the key differences. I'm not going to go through everything. But one of the things I would mention that often comes up when I talk to clients is the U.S. concept of PII, so personal identifiable information, right? So it's construed fairly narrowly. So you're talking about, the addresses, email addresses, social security numbers, credit card numbers, things like that. In Europe, the concept of personal data is much broader. So, for example, the courts and the enforcers of these European data protection laws have interpreted that personal data can be, for example, a cookie or a device identifier, an IP address, or because with reasonable effort you can determine who the actual person is behind those identifiers. So there's already a sort of a cultural and a normative difference between the EU and the US. So in the US, the understanding of what is this personal information is kind of narrow, and so and then the other thing is that in Europe, all processors of personal data, like anyone who processes personal information, is covered by these laws in Europe and in the US. Again, the scope of these laws is not countrywide or covering all companies using personal identifiable information for business purposes.
And it seems like they have a lot more specific rules in place in terms of actually keeping data and what data you can keep.
Correct. There's all kinds of laws and rules in place about how long you can retain the data, whether you even actually have any basis for processing the data at all. There's all the lists of legal basis under which you can process personal data, and if you don't have one of those, you can't. So that already cuts out a lot of companies that data aggregators if you don't have a legal basis for that processing.
That's a really good point, and I think there's many a business model in this space where the value's in the data, and so they're kind of, I think the entrepreneur wants to accumulate as much data as they can, but we also try and build our services and products with a minimum viable product. So what you're doing today may not justify you actually accumulating the data. So that sounds like it's a tricky problem, especially if you're in Europe.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, let's just talk about Asia Pacific very, very briefly. Is there any consistency to the rules there, or what do we do as a software services company that's trying to go global, and how should we be thinking about AP?
Yeah, if we stay in the Beacosystem, for example, I think that if there is any consistency, the consistency is basically there's 2 points. There's general agreement about them. One is that and beacons help in getting, especially when you add, mobile apps and segmentation around those beacons. You add context to beacons. They do generally give you precise location data about where this mobile device is located in the physical space. So both in the EU and in the US, and also, for example, in Asia Pacific, Japan, Korea. You have to get opt-in consent to access this precise location data. And then another thing that's sort of fairly common is that if you're accessing any sensitive personal data, sensitive PII, what is sensitive differs a little bit, but you can generally talk about things like health, sexual preferences, things like that a person would not want to disclose in public. That you should not either direct advertising or collect such data in the first place without having that person's opt-in consent. And then, for example, in the U.S., the advertising industry guidelines generally don't allow, or the codes of conduct don't allow for segmentation of advertising based on sensitive data categories.
Interesting. Okay, well, that's, I think, a good step towards what are the best practices, and you do a great job of summarizing them, and we're kind of running short on time, so we'll quickly go through these. And it seems like, I know, because I read your chapter several times, that consent is a key thing. How should beacon owners be gaining consent?
Well, first of all, if you think about what is a beacon owner? I mean, there's companies that are installing beacons, and then there are companies making use of those beacons through mobile applications, right? And then there are, for example, property owners, you name it. But in any event, the how the interaction to consumers takes place is through the mobile device, right? So the mobile devices themselves already have kind of robust mechanisms for accepting data collection through or by with the help of beacons. They ask you if you agree to the collection of your location data. They keep asking it throughout the life cycle of the app on your phone, and then some apps also tell you about why location data would be helpful to the person's experience with the app. And then there are also opt-out mechanisms in place, so the consumer can, for example, disable location service on their phone, disable them for a particular app, and things like that. So those device is already helpful. It gives consumers a lot of tools to control this kind of data collection. But then what is important that the ecosystem, meaning the companies installing the apps, mobile devices, using the app, the companies installing the beacons, the apps making use of those beacons, and then the third parties who then collect data in the background, that they have a coordinated chain of custody for the data, and each in that chain of custody has proper disclosures in place about data collection. But the mobile app, of course, is at the forefront with the consumer, and has to make sure that the consumer has a clear understanding of the types of data collection. Of course, opt in for a collection of location data. So that's a key, right?
Right. Okay, so very quick, simplistic. Should we be opt-in or opt-out? Obviously, as a marketeer, I'd prefer to just give people the opportunity of opting out and default that they're opted in. Can I do that?
Yeah, I mean, we should be opt-in. We should be opt-in for at least for the collection of location data. I mean, there's of course other types of data that are being collected in connection with mobile apps as well. And there, the key is privacy policy. Make sure that what you state in your privacy policy is actually true and corresponds with the reality.
Okay. What about notice? So what does notice mean? And does that mean I need to have signs up in the stores, just like I have signs up that say there's a security camera? Do I need to have signs up that say, hey, we've got beacons in here?
Well, the technology is constantly developing, and of course, giving meaningful notice will change over time. What that means right now might be a completely different thing a couple of years down the line. I'm not sure if we're going to see too many signs, because people tend to there was a study actually about it. People don't tend to notice such signs, that they tend to ignore them in the retail environment if there are any, because they don't even understand what the symbols mean, really. Right. Generally. So again, here the key is mobile disclosures, I think, and going forward, I think this will remain the case, because the mobile device, the consumer is holding it, the consumer is holding the app, so the prominent disclosure in the app is I think is going forward still remains the key solution to provide notice.
And is it okay if I have like a huge amount of small print and I have a lot of legal jargon, or do I actually have to put it somewhere where someone might actually read it and use words that people might actually understand?
Yeah, it has to be prominent. It has to be clear. It has to be written in a language that even almost a child could read, so that it makes clear what data you're collecting, what purposes do you use the data for, how long do you keep the data, and who do you give the data to, who do you disclose it to. Those are the sort of the key elements, and it has to be updated as data practices develop over time.
Okay, and the thing that I find most difficult to understand is this issue of who does what in a very complex ecosystem. So you have the person that owns the beacon, the person that owns the app, the person that owns the data. There may be several people that think that they own the data. How, if I'm a data management platform that's plugged into a programmatic advertising network,
Mm-hmm.
how on earth can I meet my obligations when it's not even my app?
Well, I mean, if you're not consumer facing directly, if you're what is called a third party, of course, you have to obtain a reasonable assurances contractually, for example, that those in the chain of custody of that data have, given proper notices, have obtained opt-in consent for collection of location data, and make sure that you use the data only for such purposes that consumers have been told about. So, for example, if you use the data for advertising, we should verify, for example, the apps collecting that data have told consumers in their privacy policies that this data can be used for example, for third-party advertising.
Okay, so it's got to be not only is it got to be in the customer-facing agreement, but it's got to be in the agreement between the data broker and all the people they're connected in, and maybe it's going through a couple of links in that chain of custody and responsibility.
Yes.
Who owns the data? So,
I mean, ideally, who owns the data? I mean, I think it's more that who's responsible for the data.
Okay.
And we're all responsible for the data that we're collecting through our mobile apps and beacons and all those. So we're the custodians of that data for those purposes that we've told consumers that we use for the data for. So I think there's all the philosophical debate whether you own your personal data or your PII, but I still think that what serves the industry better is that we have to understand our responsibilities for this data and protect it well and use it only for such purposes that we've told consumers that we'd use it for.
And then let's see, I think just two last questions before we wrap up. So one is just say a little bit more about the security obligations we have. So you talked about the restrictions in terms of gathering really sensitive data, but what should people be thinking? How much security is enough security when I'm guarding a bunch of personal data about where people have been and what their movements have been?
I would say that on the security side, of course, the level of security depends on the type of data that you're collecting, and then there's also a saying that everybody's been hacked, they just don't know it. I mean, one could argue that in reality, no security is sufficient security because systems can always be hacked. Take industry standard measures to protect personal data. You only give access to any personal data that you process, including, for example, like device IDs and things like that can be accessed through the Beacosystem. And generally, if you make security promises on your privacy policies, make sure that you can actually meet those promises in reality. Not many companies can do, and then they run the risk of being subject to FTC enforcement because they've lied to consumers about their data security practice. There are several cases on this topic that the FTC has dealt with on very large global companies. And therefore, don't promise that you're going to keep your users' data safe forever. So it's just something to remember.
Yeah, be careful what you promise seems to be one of the underlying themes. And you've actually already talked quite a lot.
At the same time, you keep up to date with your data security technologies, keep your data in secure databases. All those things, of course, are basic things that you should be doing, but don't overpromise on security.
Got it. And then I don't know. Is there anything more to say about where this goes in the future? You've already talked about where the EU is headed, and who knows what the UK is going to be doing if and when it leaves the EU. But any other thoughts about where this is headed in the future?
Well, I think that, this. I mean, beacons are. If we talk about Beacosystem again, because there's so many things we could talk about where what future of privacy is going on. But then Beacosystem, I think, beacons are just going to be spreading everywhere. So. And at the industrial level, we have to think about how we resolve this issue of, for example, meaningful notice to consumers. Is it could be surprising to consumers when they walk into a physical space, for example, a supermarket or a mall, and then there's all this data collection going on there. So we have to come up with solutions and how to tell people about this, but also tell people about the benefits of beacons, because there are really many useful benefits for consumers on beacon technology, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And so I know that one of the things you've been working on is the idea of having a central place where folks can go to actually see what data is being collected. And that, to me, I'm an idealist. I think that's a great idea, and we just need to make it easier for people to do this.
And it has to work in practice. So again, as an industry, we have to come up with a solution that works, because we can't provide an opt-out. It applies to other, proximity technologies and basically anything. For example, cookies and things like that on the internet. That we have to provide opt-out mechanisms that work. Kind of health measures are not going to satisfy the consumers. They're just going to be pissed off because they thought that that this opt-out worked, and then they see their device ID disappearing elsewhere. So we just got to be and this requires industry level sort of cooperation and coordination.
Yeah, so I know Unicast has been doing some work in that area. People should go to their website and check out the work they're doing. I think that's a really interesting approach. Well, Jarno, thanks so much. Your time is really valuable, and I think this information you've provided us is very helpful. Appreciate it.
Glad to hear it. It was a pleasure. Thank you so much, Stephen.
And thanks for the chapter in the book. Great work.
Thank you so much. Appreciate that.
How do you feel about going to Mars? If you were told that you had to go there, would that be good news or bad news?
A little claustrophobic, so I don't know how I would handle the actual trip there.
Okay. Well, it probably wouldn't get much better when you arrive. So a reluctant traveler, but you're on there anyway. What if, for some bizarre reason, you could only take 3 songs? Which are the songs that you would take with you?
Well, this is a difficult question because I listen to so much music. I have 17,000 songs on my iTunes and more on the Spotify I listen to. But I think of 3 right now. I could say I was thinking of Pink Floyd's "Wish You Were Here" and Guns N' Roses' "Paradise City" and Alphaville's "Forever Young."
All right, very good. Well, there's a great song. And Guns N' Roses were actually just here in San Diego just a few days ago.
I was happy to see them reunite, yeah.
All right, and so why did you choose those songs?
Well, they're just kind of a good representation of different stages of my life. There's songs that play critical roles in my teens, 20s, 30s kind of thing. So,
all right. So you're a Pink Floyd fan then and now, presumably.
Yeah, absolutely. I went to Roger Waters in Philly.
Cool. Okay. Well, thanks for sharing that.